Hello, my friends. My name is Robert Morgan, or Caesar, my first official story on this digital radio station. Greetings to all my colleagues at the channel, both old and new. To avoid any misunderstanding, this channel is a radio station with many content creators. So, if you'd like to hear me again, go to the channel in the playlist under the name Robert Morgan. Welcome to The Meat Grinder. Back in the winter of 1963, I worked the graveyard shift as an embalmer down in the basement morgue of St. Jude's Hospital. It was a decrepit brick fortress built back in the late 1800s, sitting on the rough side of town where the streetlights barely worked. The air down in that basement was thick, permanently sour with the stinging burn of formaldehyde, wet concrete, and old iron rust. My shift ran from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., and most nights it was just me, a buzzing fluorescent tube that flickered every 10 seconds, and an old wood cabinet radio humming country tunes over static. Rule number one in my line of work was real simple. Dead bodies don't move, and they sure as hell don't talk. You do your job, drain the blood, prep the veins, lock up, and collect your paycheck. I had worked enough nights down there to become comfortable with things most people couldn't even stand looking at. I knew every sound the basement made. The pipes knocking behind the walls. The old elevator groaning whenever someone used it upstairs. The slow drip from the sink in the corner. Even the occasional scratching sound inside the walls didn't bother me anymore. Rats, I figured. Everything had an explanation if you were willing to accept the boring one. That was how I survived the job. You never gave the darkness more meaning than it deserved. Sometimes, though, the basement felt different after midnight. There were nights when the fluorescent lights would flicker and I would get the strange sensation that someone had just walked behind me. I'd turn around and find an empty hallway. I'd listen for footsteps, hear nothing, and go back to work. I told myself it was exhaustion. 12-hour shifts will make your brain manufacture things. Well, everything went sideways on a bitter, rain-slicked Tuesday night in November. It was 2:30 a.m., the wind howling through the street grates overhead, when the heavy steel basement doors rattled open. Two paramedics from the county service rolled a stretcher down the concrete ramp. They had an old Ford station wagon converted into an ambulance back then, and whenever that beast pulled up late at night, you knew somebody's life had ended real bad. The driver, a hardened guy named Hank who'd seen every gruesome accident in the county, looked pale as a sheet. He handed me the clipboard without saying a single word, his hand shaking so bad the ballpoint pen rattled against the metal frame. I noticed something strange about Hank before he left. He wouldn't look at the body. Not once. His eyes stayed fixed on the floor while the other paramedic helped me move the stretcher into position. When I asked what happened, Hank only swallowed hard and said, "Route 9. That's it." He looked at me then, and there was something in his face I had never seen on him before. Fear. Not the kind you get after a bad wreck. Not shock. Something deeper. Then he shook his head and walked away. The tag on the toe said, "Unidentified male. Approximate 40 years old, single vehicle collision on Route 9. They transferred the heavy body onto my iron slab and left in a hurry, not even sticking around for their usual cigarette break. I stood there alone in the yellow light, pulling back the heavy rubber sheet. The guy was built broad, dressed in a shredded tweed coat. But as soon as I pulled his shirt open to prep the incision site, a knot tightened dead in my gut. The basement room was freezing, so cold you could see your breath in thick plumes, but the body wasn't losing heat. When I laid my bare wrist against his chest out of habit, the skin was warm. Not just warm, it was hot, like a stove burner turning down. I pulled my hand away immediately. For a few seconds, I just stared at my own palm. Then I looked at him again. His face seemed different somehow. I couldn't explain how. Nothing obvious had changed, but the longer I stared, the more uncomfortable I became. His mouth looked slightly open, like he had been about to say something when death interrupted him. I reached over and closed it. The jaw stayed shut for maybe 3 seconds. Then it slowly dropped open again. I stopped breathing. I told myself it was gravity. I told myself it was nothing. But deep down, something in me had already started screaming that I was standing in that room with something that wasn't supposed to be there. Then came the part that made my blood run backwards. Underneath his pale, bruised skin, dark blue veins that should have been lifeless and flat started writhing. They were twisting and crawling slowly across his ribs, moving like a nest of black worms trying to dig their way out through his chest. I took 3 fast steps back, knocking my glass jar of chemical disinfectant straight off the counter. It shattered on the floor with a loud crack, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the iron slab. I tried telling myself it was post-mortem muscle spasms, gas buildup, or some medical nonsense you read about in textbooks to keep yourself from losing your mind. I reached over to the tray, grabbed a clean cotton rag, and soaked it in ice water to wipe the dried mud and road grit off his face. My hands were trembling so violently I could barely hold the cloth. The radio behind me suddenly lost the country station. Static filled the room. I turned my head toward it, annoyed more than frightened at first. I reached for the dial, but before my fingers touched it, the static stopped. A man's voice came through, very faint, almost too faint to understand. I stood there listening. The voice seemed to be saying something, but the words were buried beneath a low electrical hum. I leaned closer. Then I realized the voice wasn't coming from the radio. It was coming from behind me. I slowly turned around. The corpse hadn't moved. At least, I thought it hadn't. Its face was still pointed toward the ceiling. Its mouth was still slightly open. I swallowed and looked back at the radio. Now the country music was playing again. I laughed once under my breath, but there was no humor in it. It was the kind of nervous laugh a man makes when he's trying to convince himself that he's still in control. I leaned over the body, pressing the wet rag against his temple. The exact second that damp cloth touched his forehead, his left eye popped wide open. It didn't open slow like someone waking up from a deep sleep. It snapped open with a wet, heavy click. His eye wasn't brown or blue. It was milky white, completely clouded over, staring dead up at the flickering ceiling bulb. My heart dropped straight into my boots. I screamed, dropping the rag, but my brain kept trying to rationalize it. Eyelids retract due to muscle spasms, right? I reached down with my right thumb, pressing hard against his eyelid to force it back shut. The muscle under his skin was locked stiff as solid iron. It wouldn't budge a millimeter. And right as I was pushing down, his chest suddenly heaved upward with a violent jerk. A massive, ragged breath tore into his lungs, except he wasn't breathing the room's air. It felt like he was literally sucking every ounce of oxygen right out of that basement. The temperature in the room plummeted 10 degrees in a single second. My vision blurred, my ears popped from the sudden pressure drop, and the entire morgue filled with a rotten, suffocating stench of sulfur and stagnant swamp water that burned the back of my throat like poison. I stumbled backward until my hip struck the counter. The corpse exhaled. That was the worst part, because I could hear the breath moving through its lungs. Slow, wet, deep, like a man who had been underwater for hours and had finally reached the surface. I watched his chest rise again, then fall, rise, fall. Every breath seemed to make the fluorescent light above me dim slightly. I wanted to run. Every instinct in my body told me to leave the room, lock the basement doors, and call somebody upstairs. But my legs wouldn't move. The mill key, I remained fixed on the ceiling. Then the second I twitched, just once, I stopped breathing. The man's fingers moved. Not much, just the smallest movement of one finger against the iron slab. Tap. I stared at it. Tap. Another finger moved. Tap. 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 It sounded almost deliberate, like someone knocking from inside a coffin. I whispered, "You're dead." The eye moved. Slowly. For For the first time, it turned away from the ceiling and looked directly at me. A sharp crack of thunder rattled the high basement windows from the storm raging outside on the street. A second later, the main fuse box on the wall sparked violently, shooting a bright shower of orange embers across the concrete floor. The fluorescent light gave one last screeching buzz and died. Darkness slammed down on the morgue like a heavy iron vault door. It was pitch black, man. The kind of thick, heavy dark where you hold your hand an inch from your nose and see absolutely nothing. The only sound was my own frantic breathing and the rain pounding against the pavement up above. I reached into my coat pocket, my fingernails digging into my heavy chrome flashlight. I clicked the switch. The yellow beam flickered twice before holding steady. For a few seconds, I didn't move. I just listened. The rain, my breathing, the hum of the old electrical system. Then I heard something else. A slow, wet sound, coming from somewhere near the slab. I raised the flashlight. Nothing. The beam swept over the floor. Nothing. I could feel sweat running down my back despite the cold. I kept telling myself the body had to be there. It had to. Bodies didn't simply disappear. The doors were locked. The only exit was behind me. I swept the light across the room, terrified of what the beam would catch. The light hit the iron slab, and my blood ran ice cold. The slab was empty. The rubber sheet was tossed onto the floor, dripping with a thick black liquid. The body was gone. "Hank," I called out, my voice cracking like a terrified kid. "Is somebody playing a prank?" No answer. Just the steady drip, drip, drip of water from the rusted sink. Then, from the far back corner of the room where we kept the spare wooden caskets, I heard it. Wet, bare feet dragging slowly across the cold tile floor. Slurp, drag, slurp, drag. Then came a sharp metallic clinking sound. Someone was running fingers over my surgical tray, picking up the steel scalpels and bone saws one by one. I raised the flashlight toward the sound. The beam stopped at the corner. Nothing. The surgical tray was empty. I knew it hadn't been empty a second earlier. I stepped forward. 1 foot, then another. The sound stopped. I froze. For several seconds, there was absolute silence. Then something tapped the wooden casket beside me. Once. I turned toward it. Another tap, this time from inside. My stomach tightened. I backed away slowly, keeping the flashlight fixed on the coffin. Another tap. Then 3 quick knocks. I knew that pattern. Every embalmer knew it. It was the sound people joked about when they talked about old horror stories. 3 knocks from inside a coffin. I wanted to tell myself there was some rational explanation, but I had just watched a dead man disappear from an iron slab. There was nothing rational left. The flashlight suddenly flickered. For one brief second, the beam went completely dark. When it came back on, the wooden casket was open, and something wet was standing behind it. I couldn't see the face, only the outline. Tall, completely still. I blinked. The shape was gone. Then I heard the dragging footsteps directly behind me. Slurp, drag, slurp, drag. I backed up until my shoulder blade slammed against the cold brick wall next to the exit door. I kept the flashlight beam pointed straight ahead, sweeping the narrow aisles between the stainless steel storage cabinets. The air felt thick, like trying to swim through wet concrete, and every breath burned deep in my lungs. Out of nowhere, a raspy, ice-cold whisper hit me right behind my left ear. It wasn't coming from across the room. It was right there, less than an inch from my neck. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. Every muscle in my body locked. The whisper came again, softer this time, almost affectionate. It wasn't a normal human voice. It sounded like 3 different voices speaking at the exact same time. One deep and hollow, one high and screeching, and one that sounded eerily like my own voice. "You really thought a soul just leaves that easy, Tommy?" I froze dead in my tracks. Nobody at the hospital called me Tommy. Only my mother used that name, and she had passed away back in 1948. I stared at the exit door. My hand was only inches from the handle. I could have opened it. I could have run. But the whisper had taken something from me that I didn't understand. It had made me remember my mother's voice. Not the memory of her voice. The actual sound. The exact way she used to say my name. Tommy. I hadn't heard it in 15 years. The whisper started spilling secrets. Horrible, buried things from my childhood back in the 40s. It recited the time I watched a neighborhood boy drown in the river and ran away because I was too scared to call for help. It rattled off dates, times, and exact thoughts I'd kept buried in my head for 20 years. This wasn't some medical anomaly or a man who survived a car crash. This was an ancient, malicious entity, something dark that had stepped through the door of death and was looking for a fresh, breathing vessel to inhabit. It told me things I had never spoken aloud, things nobody knew. It knew the exact color of the coat I was wearing when the boy drowned. It knew the name I had whispered to myself afterward. It even described the smell of the river that night. Rotting leaves, mud, cold water, and underneath all of it, the smell of something dead. I pressed my palms against my ears. It didn't matter. The voice wasn't traveling through the air. It was inside my head. I heard my own voice whispering from somewhere behind my thoughts. You left him. I shook my head. No. You watched. No. You ran. I closed my eyes. The river came back. The boy's hands. His fingers disappearing beneath the black surface. His mouth opening. The sound he made. I had spent 20 years convincing myself I remembered none of it. Now every detail was returning, and the thing behind me knew every single one. Then it whispered the sentence that made my knees nearly collapse. Your mother remembers too. I opened my eyes. The flashlight beam was shaking violently. At the end of the aisle stood the corpse. Its head was tilted. Its milky eyes were watching me. And behind it, in the darkness, I heard a woman's voice softly say my name. Tommy. I spun around, swinging that heavy chrome flashlight like a baseball bat. The beam caught him. The corpse was standing dead on its feet, tall and unnatural, its neck bent at an impossible 90-degree angle toward its left shoulder. Its face was completely drained of color, skin stretched tight over bone, and both eyes were wide open, milky white with no pupils at all. For half a second, neither of us moved. I stared at it. It stared at me. The morgue seemed to hold its breath. I could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above me, but even that sound seemed distant, like I was hearing it from underwater. My fingers tightened around the flashlight until my knuckles hurt. I remember thinking that if I moved first, something terrible would happen. I don't know why I believed that. I just did. Then its mouth slowly opened. Not enough to attack, just enough to smile. I felt something cold crawl down my spine. Before I could scream, it lunged. It moved with unnatural, jerky speed, tackling me hard to the concrete floor. The flashlight flew out of my hand, rolling under a cabinet and casting long, dancing shadows across the ceiling. The corpse pinned me down, its weight crushing my chest. Its hands clamped around my throat like a pair of iron vice grips. The skin on its fingers was freezing cold, wet with that foul black grease. I clawed at its face, digging my fingernails into its cheeks, but it didn't even flinch. It felt like trying to scratch a stone statue. I tried screaming. Nothing came out. Its fingers tightened. My vision began to pulse. The room started shrinking around me. The ceiling seemed lower, the walls closer, and every breath I tried to take felt smaller than the one before it. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding inside my ears, fast and uneven, while the corpse remained completely silent. That silence frightened me more than any scream could have. For one terrifying second, I wasn't in the morgue anymore. I was back beside the river. I could hear rushing water. I could hear the boy screaming. Then I heard my mother's voice. Tommy, don't look. I opened my eyes. The corpse was still above me, but now its face looked different. For a moment, I saw the face of the drowned boy, then my mother's, then my own. I blinked hard. The corpse's face returned. but the images stayed in my mind. I could still see them every time I blinked, as if something had pressed those faces behind my eyes. I tried telling myself it wasn't real, that I was suffocating, that my brain was losing oxygen and creating memories. But somewhere inside me, I knew that explanation wasn't enough. The corpse leaned down, opening its jaw unnaturally wide, far wider than any human jaw should open, until the skin at the corners of its mouth tore with a sickening snap. From deep down in its throat, a thick, greasy black smoke began pouring out, smelling of burnt hair and old blood. It was trying to force its open jaw over my mouth, suffocating me, pumping that demonic smoke straight down into my lungs to erase my soul and take my body. The smoke reached my face. I could feel it against my skin. It was freezing, then burning, both at once. My lungs spasmed as I tried to hold my breath, but the pressure on my chest was crushing me. The entity whispered through the smoke, "Let me in." I shook my head. Its grip tightened. "Let me in." The words echoed through my skull. Then another voice joined it. My mother's voice. "Tommy, it's okay." My eyes filled with tears. For one terrible moment, I almost believed her. I almost stopped fighting. That was what it wanted. Not my strength. Not my body. My surrender. I realized that as long as I was afraid, I was still myself. So I fought harder. I kicked. I twisted. I clawed at its wrists. But my body was beginning to weaken. My arms felt heavy, my fingers numb, and the edges of my vision were turning black. I could no longer tell whether the whispering was coming from the corpse or from inside my own head. Every time I tried to breathe, I felt the smoke pushing closer, and every time I closed my eyes, I heard my mother telling me there was nothing to be afraid of. That was the worst part. It knew exactly what voice would make me stop fighting. For a moment, I wondered if the thing had been waiting for me all along, waiting for the exact person, the exact memory, the exact weakness it could use. The thought made something inside me snap. I didn't want to die on that cold floor. I didn't want to disappear behind those white, empty eyes. The corpse lowered its face closer to mine. The black smoke poured between us, and somewhere beneath the terror, my hand found something heavy lying on the floor. My vision started tunneling into black spots. My lungs were screaming for air, and my arms were growing weak. With the last burst of adrenaline I had left, my right hand blindly swept across the floor behind me. My fingers brushed against a heavy glass bottle, a gallon jug of chemical embalming fluid that had fallen off the shelf during the struggle. For one terrible second, I couldn't find it. My fingers slid across the cold concrete, searching blindly while the pressure around my throat tightened again. I could feel the corpse leaning closer, its breathless presence hovering over my face. My heart was pounding so violently that I could barely hear anything else. I remember thinking that this was it, not because I had accepted death, but because my body was beginning to accept it for me. Then my fingers touched glass. I grabbed it by the neck and smashed it directly against the side of the corpse's head. The glass shattered, drenching its face and chest in volatile formaldehyde. The entity gasped, its grip on my throat loosening for a fraction of a second. I reached into my coat pocket with my left hand, pulled out my brass Zippo lighter, flicked the wheel, and threw the spark right at its face. Effluent. Bright orange flames erupted instantly, consuming the corpse's head and chest. The entity let out a high-pitched, demonic shriek that shattered every glass bottle in the room and vibrated right through the concrete floorboards. It thrashed wildly, falling backward onto the floor, clawing at its own burning face as the black smoke burned away into gray ash. For a few seconds, I couldn't move. I lay there staring at the flames. The thing on the floor was screaming. But beneath that scream, I heard something else. A whisper. "Tommy." My blood went cold. The fire was roaring, the bottles were cracking, and the alarms had begun screaming somewhere above me. Yet that single word sounded closer than everything else in the room. It didn't feel like it came from the burning body. It felt like someone had whispered directly beside my ear. I pushed myself backward on my elbows. The fire grew higher. The corpse twisted. The whisper came again. "Tommy." I covered my ears. The entity let out one final shriek. Then its body collapsed inward. The smoke rose toward the ceiling, twisting into shapes that looked almost human before disappearing into the ventilation grate. I watched those shapes until the last trace vanished. For a moment, I thought I saw a woman's face inside the smoke, staring down at me through the darkness. I blinked. There was nothing there. Right then, the heavy wooden doors of the morgue were kicked open. The night janitor and 2 security guards came bursting in with emergency lanterns. They saw me crawling across the floor, covered in soot, blood, and chemical burns, while the corpse burned itself out on the tile floor. One of the guards immediately grabbed a fire extinguisher. The other stood frozen in the doorway. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved toward the body. The janitor looked at me, then at the burning corpse, then back at me. "How long has that been burning?" I tried to answer. My throat wouldn't work. They eventually put the fire out. But when the smoke cleared, there was almost nothing left. No normal remains. No recognizable bones. Just a dark stain burned into the tile. The next morning, the hospital administration told me the man had died in the ambulance before reaching St. Jude's. I told them that was impossible. I had seen him breathe. I had seen him stand. I had felt his hands around my throat. They didn't believe me. Maybe they couldn't. Maybe they didn't want to. I handed in my keys that very night in 1963 and never set foot in a hospital again. But real talk, the mental scar never left. Every time I see someone sleeping in the dark, I freeze up, terrified they're gonna pop one Milky. I open and whisper, "I'm still here." For years, I couldn't sleep in a completely dark room. I needed a lamp, a television, anything that made noise, because silence reminded me of that basement. Sometimes, just before falling asleep, I would hear 3 quiet knocks from somewhere inside the walls. I never investigated. I never wanted to know. And every November, when the rain comes down hard and the streets get slick under the yellow lamps, I remember that body lying on the iron slab. I remember the warmth of its skin. I remember the veins moving underneath it. And most of all, I remember the voice. Not the demon's voice. My mother's. Because the last time I heard her say my name, she wasn't standing beside me. She was standing somewhere in the darkness. And even after all these years, there are nights when I swear I can still hear her whispering from just outside my bedroom door. "Tommy," and I never answer. Back in the bitter winter of 1973, I was making a living with a wooden-handled shovel and a heavy pickaxe, digging graves at Oak Ridge Cemetery, a sprawling, overgrown burial ground built in the 1800s on the dark edge of town. It was lonesome work, but it paid the bills during a hard year. On a freezing Tuesday night in December, the graveyard caretaker pounded on my cabin door at 11:30 p.m. A wealthy family down in the valley had just lost their son to a sudden, unexplainable illness, and they wanted him buried 6 feet deep before sunrise. Double pay in cash. I remember staring at the caretaker for a few seconds without saying anything. Something about the request bothered me, though I couldn't explain why. Nobody wanted a grave dug at midnight unless there was some reason they couldn't wait until morning. I asked him why the family was in such a hurry. He just looked past me into the cabin. "Don't ask too many questions tonight." That sentence stayed with me. For some reason, I didn't like the way he said it. It wasn't a warning from a man trying to protect me. It sounded more like a man who already knew something was waiting out there, something he had no intention of explaining. I remember glancing toward the dark window behind him, suddenly wondering if someone else was standing outside. Nobody was. At least, I didn't see anyone. I hauled my heavy coat on, grabbed an oil lantern, my iron pickaxe, and a flathead spade, and trudged out into the black night. The winter wind was howling through the bare oak trees, making the old branches creak like rusted iron. The ground was frozen hard as steel on top, but beneath that crust, the soil was jet black, dense, and heavy with water. The cemetery looked different that night. I had walked through those rows hundreds of times, but under that black sky, every headstone seemed taller, every narrow path seemed longer, and every shadow seemed to stretch farther than it should. The lantern hanging from my hand cast a small circle of yellow light around my boots, but beyond that circle was nothing but darkness. I kept hearing the sound of my own footsteps. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Then, every once in a while, another sound seemed to follow. A softer step. Behind me. I stopped. The sound stopped too. I turned around and raised the lantern. Nothing. Just rows of wet headstones and crooked trees moving in the wind. I told myself I was tired. That was all. But when I started walking again, I found myself counting my footsteps without realizing it. 10 steps. Then I looked back. 10 more. Then I looked back again. Each time, the cemetery appeared empty, yet the feeling of being followed became stronger. I could feel the muscles between my shoulders tightening as though I was waiting for someone to touch me. By 1:15 a.m., I was 3 feet down into the trench, working under the dull yellow glow of the lantern hanging from a wooden post overhead. A cold, miserable rain started coming down, turning the fresh dirt into thick, slick mud. But every time I drove the iron pickaxe into the earth, a weird vibration traveled up the wooden handle and rattled straight through my arms. It felt like striking a mattress stuffed with wet rubber. The dirt under my heavy rubber boots felt alive, squirming and shifting every time I stepped down, like something deep below was turning over in its sleep. I stopped digging for a moment and listened. Nothing. I drove the pickaxe down again. Thud. The vibration ran through my hands. I looked down at the ground beneath my boots. For a second, I could have sworn I felt something move. Not the dirt settling. Not water. Something else. Something slow. Something underneath me. I stepped backward. The mud shifted beneath my boot. I froze. My heart began beating harder, and suddenly the grave felt much smaller than it had a few minutes earlier. I looked toward the cemetery entrance, wondering if I should simply walk away and return the money. Then I remembered the caretaker's warning. Don't ask too many questions tonight. I tightened my grip on the pickaxe and kept digging, but from that moment on, I couldn't stop imagining the earth beneath me opening. Every time the pickaxe disappeared into the soil, I expected it to strike something that would strike back. I started listening between every swing, waiting for another sound from below. Nothing came, and somehow, that made me even more afraid. By 2 a.m., I was 5 feet deep in the narrow trench. The mud was up to my shins, heavy, clinging to my clothes. I raised the pickaxe over my shoulder and brought it down with everything I had into the pit. Thud! The iron tip hit something hollow. It didn't sound like granite, and it didn't sound like tree roots. It sounded like thick, wet wood. I dropped the axe, knelt in the cold slurry, and started scraping the earth away with my bare fingers. 6 inches down, I uncovered a line of rotted oak planks. I had dug right onto the side wall of an old brick crypt built in the 1920s that had collapsed and been swallowed by earth decades ago. I leaned down close, bringing the oil lantern closer to get a better look at the rotten wood. That's when the noise started. Scratch, scratch, thud. It was coming from inside the sealed crypt behind that rotted wood wall. A sharp scraping sound, like long human fingernails dragging across dry wood, desperate to claw through the dirt and get into the fresh pit I'd just opened. I stopped breathing. The sound stopped too. For several seconds, there was nothing. I stared at the rotten planks, trying to convince myself that I had imagined it. The silence seemed worse than the scratching. I could hear my heartbeat pounding inside my ears, so loud that I wondered if the thing behind the wall could hear it too. Then I heard it again. Scratch, scratch, Thud. I slowly moved the lantern closer. The wood was old and blackened with moisture. There were no openings large enough for anything living to get through. Whatever was making that sound was on the other side. I told myself it could be an animal, a rat, a trapped fox, anything. But animals didn't scratch like that. It sounded deliberate, patient, almost like whatever was inside knew exactly where I was standing. That thought settled into my mind and refused to leave. I stared at the wall, suddenly aware of how small the trench was. 5 feet of mud surrounded me on every side. If something came through that crypt, there would be nowhere to run. I backed away from the wall. The scratching followed. I moved left. Scratch. I moved right. Scratch. I stopped. The scratching stopped. My mouth went dry. I stared at the planks and whispered, "No." The answer came immediately. Thud. The entire wooden wall shook. I jumped backward so hard my boot slipped in the mud. The lantern swung wildly, throwing distorted shadows across the grave walls. For a second, those shadows looked like fingers stretching toward me. I blinked. They were gone. I raised the lantern again. Scratch. This time, the sound was slower, almost gentle, as if something on the other side was dragging one fingernail across the wood just to let me know it was still there. I felt pressure building in my chest. I wanted to climb out, but my body wouldn't move. My hands had gone cold despite the sweat running down my back. Then came 3 knocks. Thud, thud, thud. I knew I needed to leave. But before I could climb out, something knocked again. And this time, the sound came from directly beneath my feet. I stood perfectly still. The mud around my boots seemed to tighten. I couldn't make myself move. I kept staring at the planks, waiting for them to split open, but nothing happened. Then I heard another sound, a faint scrape beneath the floor. It moved from one side of the grave to the other, slowly, as if something underneath me was searching for the exact place where I was standing. I lifted one boot. The sound stopped. I lowered it down again. Scratch. My stomach turned. Whatever was down there wasn't simply making noise. It was responding to me. For the first time that night, I understood I wasn't alone in the grave. Something knew I was there. The worst part wasn't that something was trapped beneath me. It was thinking it had been awake the entire time. Maybe the crypt hadn't collapsed by accident. Maybe whatever was inside had listened to footsteps above for decades, waiting for someone to dig close enough. I looked toward the top of the trench. The cemetery was empty. No workers. No headlights. No distant voices. Just black trees moving in the wind. I felt buried instead of the person whose grave I was digging. The walls seemed closer. The darkness above seemed far away. Then the scratching began again. Not from the wall. From beneath me. Scratch. 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 Each sound came from a different spot under the mud, circling my boots. I held the lantern down and watched the flame. Then something pressed upward beneath my right boot. Not enough to lift it, just enough for me to feel it. A slow pressure against the sole. I froze. The pressure disappeared. Then it came back, exactly where my foot was. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. Something scraped its fingernails against the earth as if learning how deep I was. I finally understood what terrified me most. It wasn't trying to get out. It was trying to find me. Panic hit me like a bucket of ice water. I tossed my spade out of the pit, grabbed the wooden post, and hauled myself up the slick mud wall like a madman. I collapsed onto the wet grass up top, chest heaving, cold rain stinging my eyes. For a few seconds, I couldn't even force myself to look behind me. My hands were shaking so badly that I nearly dropped the lantern. I grabbed it, raised it high, and swept the yellow light across the dark tombstones. Standing right on the muddy edge of my open grave was a figure. I didn't understand what I was looking at first. My brain kept trying to turn it into something normal. A man, an animal, a tree bent over in the wind. Anything except what it actually was. It was crouching on its haunches, knees pulled up tight to its chest. It was unnaturally tall. If it stood up straight, it had to be 7 feet high. Its body was thin as a rail, covered in matted, filthy black hair that hung down into the mud like soaked ropes. It wore no clothes, had no shoes, and its skin was a dead, bruised ash gray. I couldn't move. The lantern shook in my hand. The light trembled across its body. The figure didn't react. It simply watched me. Or at least, I felt like it was watching me. It had no eyes. That was the part my mind couldn't accept. I stared at the smooth place where its eyes should have been, waiting for something to change, waiting for some ordinary explanation to appear. Nothing did. The longer I stared, the more I became aware of how completely alone I was. The cemetery seemed to have gone silent around us, as if even the rain was afraid to make too much noise. It slowly tilted its head toward me. The lantern light hit its face, and my heart nearly stopped dead in my chest. It had no eyes, no nose, no cheeks. Its face was just a smooth, pale slate of scar tissue, except for a wide, jagged slit where a mouth should be. It sat there in total, suffocating silence, sucking every bit of heat out of the night air. The rain freezing on my heavy coat turned to solid white ice in a matter of seconds. I could hear my own heartbeat. Boom, boom, boom. The figure remained completely still. I wanted it to move. That sounds crazy, but standing there looking at something that didn't move was worse than watching something come toward you. Because as long as it stayed still, I didn't know what it wanted. I took one slow step backward. Its head tilted slightly farther. I stopped. It stopped. I moved again. Its head followed. I raised the lantern higher. The mouth opened. Just a little. No sound came out. But I suddenly felt something touch the inside of my mind. A thought that wasn't mine. Go back. I shook my head. No. The mouth opened wider. The cold became unbearable. My fingers were going numb around the lantern handle. I could barely feel the metal anymore, yet I couldn't let go of it. Something inside me kept insisting that if the lantern went out, whatever stood in front of me would no longer need to remain at a distance. I swallowed hard and tried to breathe, but every breath felt trapped halfway down my throat. Then the thing slowly lifted one long hand and pointed down into the grave. I looked over my shoulder. The pit was empty, but from somewhere beneath the mud, I heard the scratching again. Scratch, scratch, thud. When I looked back at the figure, it was standing. I couldn't remember seeing it move. One moment it was crouched there, and the next it was upright, towering above me with its head nearly level with the lower branches of the trees. My body refused to obey me. Every instinct screamed to run, but my legs felt locked into the wet ground. Then it took one step toward the grave. Not toward me, toward the hole. That frightened me more. It wasn't interested in chasing me. It was interested in what was beneath me. The figure leaned forward and stared down into the open grave, and for several seconds, I had the terrible feeling that it was listening. I stood there watching it, terrified that whatever it heard beneath the mud was something I had already heard, something that had been waiting underneath me long before I started digging. Then its head slowly turned back toward me. The mouth opened, and this time, I heard a whisper inside my own head. Keep digging. I backed away. The figure smiled without lips, and then it stepped toward me. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, backing away through the headstones. Get back, I screamed, but the wind swallowed my voice whole. I turned to scramble to my feet and run, but my boot caught an exposed tree root slick with rain. I went flying forward, hitting the mud hard. I slid straight over the lip of the trench and tumbled headfirst right back down into the 5-foot grave. The glass globe of my oil lantern smashed against the dirt wall. The flame died instantly. Pitch dark. I landed on my back in the freezing mud, the air knocked completely out of my lungs. For one terrible second, I couldn't hear anything except the ringing inside my own skull. I opened my eyes, but the darkness was absolute. I couldn't even see my own hands inches from my face. I reached blindly for the wall, desperate for something solid to hold on to, and felt wet mud sliding between my fingers. Before I could even sit up, I heard a heavy, wet thud land in the mud right next to my boots. The tall shadow had jumped down into the narrow pit with me. The grave was only 3 feet wide. There was nowhere to run. I felt freezing, slimy hands, fingers that felt like frozen roots, clamp hard around my ankles. The strength was unnatural. It started dragging me downward, pulling my legs straight through the rotted oak planks into the black void of the old crypt below. I screamed. My hands slapped against the walls. The mud collapsed around my shoulders. I tried to pull myself upward, but every movement only made the ground give way faster. Something was underneath me. I could feel empty space below my back. A hollow chamber. The crypt. The thought of falling into that darkness terrified me more than the creature itself, because I knew what was down there. I didn't know, and somehow that was worse. The fingers around my ankles tightened. I kicked wildly. My heel struck something hard. The thing made no sound. It simply pulled harder. I grabbed a root sticking out from the wall and wrapped both hands around it. For 1 second, I stopped moving. I was hanging there between the grave and the crypt. The rain hit my face. The mud dripped into my eyes. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear breathing. Not mine. Something below me was breathing slowly. In, out, in, out. I felt its breath against my boots. Then a whisper came from beneath the grave. Not words, just a long, low sound. I squeezed my eyes shut. The root began tearing loose from the wall. The mud around my fingers cracked. I knew I had seconds. The creature pulled again. My body slid another few inches downward. The darkness below opened wider. And for one horrible moment, I felt something cold brush against the sole of my boot. I almost let go of the root. My arms were shaking so badly that I could barely keep my fingers wrapped around it. I tried to convince myself that if I looked down, I would see nothing, that fear had turned the sounds into something impossible. But I didn't look. I couldn't risk seeing what was touching me. Then the fingers around my other ankle moved higher. They crawled slowly toward my calf. Not grabbing, feeling, as though whatever was holding me wanted to learn where my body ended. A wave of cold moved through my stomach. I could feel every tiny movement of those fingers through my soaked trousers, each slow touch making my skin tighten with terror. I suddenly became afraid that if I screamed again, something might answer from inside the crypt. I screamed again and pulled with everything I had. The root groaned. The mud cracked around it. Something below gave a sudden violent jerk. My body dropped several inches. My shoulders slammed against the wall. For a second, I thought I was going into the crypt. Then I heard the creature breathe directly beneath me. Slow, patient, almost amused. For one sickening moment, I imagined what would happen if my hands finally slipped. I imagined landing in that unseen chamber, unable to climb out, listening to the creature above me while something else waited below. My mind kept filling the darkness with shapes I couldn't confirm, and the more I fought those thoughts, the more real they became. I tightened my grip until my fingers burned. I didn't know whether I was holding onto the root or whether the root was the only thing holding me in this world. And I realized it wasn't trying to kill me quickly. It was waiting for me to become too tired to fight. The freezing mud swallowed my knees, then my waist. I clawed wildly at the dirt walls of the pit, but the wet earth just crumbled through my fingers. The air down there was thick, smelling of rotted wood, stale soil, and old decay. Every time I opened my mouth to gasp for air, rain and bitter black mud poured down my throat, choking me. I could feel panic tightening around my chest, making every breath shorter than the last. My mind kept screaming that I was running out of time, even though I had no idea how much time I actually had. I was pulled halfway into the dark crypt when my right hand hit something heavy buried in the mud next to my head. It was the iron pickaxe I dropped earlier. I grabbed the wooden handle with both hands, hauled it up in the pitch darkness, and swung the pointed iron pick with every last ounce of strength in my body right into the space above my boots. Splick! The iron tip sank deep into something solid and wet. A horrific, unearthly howl ripped through the narrow pit, a sound like a dying animal mixed with screeching metal. The grip on my ankles snapped loose instantly. The dark entity thrashed violently in the mud beneath me, kicking its way back down into the collapsed void of the old crypt. I didn't stop. I swung again, and again. The pickaxe struck something below me, and every impact sent a violent vibration through my arms. The thing beneath the mud screamed. I could hear it moving, scratching, scraping, trying to get away. But another part of me was terrified it wasn't getting away at all. Maybe it was circling beneath me. Maybe it was waiting for me to stop. I pulled myself upward inch by inch. My fingernails split against the frozen clay. Blood mixed with mud and rain. I barely felt it. All I could think about was reaching the surface. Then the scratching stopped. Complete silence. I froze. That silence was worse than the screaming. For several seconds, I couldn't make myself move. My breathing sounded impossibly loud inside the grave, and I became terrified that whatever was beneath me could hear every heartbeat, every trembling breath, every desperate movement. I kept waiting for the scratching to start again, but nothing came. The silence seemed to press against my ears until I almost wished I could hear the creature again. I looked down into the black opening beneath me. I couldn't see anything. Then something touched the back of my boot. I nearly lost my grip. I swung the pickaxe blindly into the darkness. Nothing. I pulled myself higher. Another touch, this time against my ankle. I screamed and kicked. The fingers disappeared. For a second, I thought it was over. Then I heard 3 slow knocks beneath me. Thud, thud, thud. The same sound from the crypt. The same sound that had started everything. I realized the creature wasn't trying to climb out anymore. It was knocking, waiting, as if it knew I would eventually come back. That thought went through me like ice. I suddenly understood that escaping the grave didn't mean I had escaped whatever lived beneath it. Maybe it didn't need to follow me. Maybe it only needed to make me believe I was safe long enough to return on my own. I grabbed the edge of the grave with both hands and pulled. The earth crumbled. I pulled again. The surface was right there. So close. Behind me, something moved in the darkness. I didn't look. I couldn't. I pulled myself upward one final time, and felt a cold hand slide across my boot before I escaped. I dragged myself onto the grass and lay there for several seconds, unable to breathe properly. My entire body was trembling, but the worst part wasn't the pain or the cold. It was the silence. There was no screaming anymore. No scratching. No movement beneath the grave. Nothing. I turned my head slowly toward the hole. The darkness inside looked completely ordinary. That frightened me more than anything, because if the thing had been wounded, I should have heard it. If it had escaped, I should have heard it. Instead, it had simply disappeared. I pushed myself to my feet and stumbled away. Behind me, the grave remained open, and just before I reached the cemetery path, I heard one final sound from inside it. Not a knock, not a scratch, a quiet breath, as though something below had just opened its mouth and was waiting for me to return. I scrambled up those muddy walls like a wild animal, digging my bleeding fingernails deep into the clay until I hauled myself onto the surface. I didn't look back. I ran through the dark cemetery, crashing through wooden gates and brush, until I hit the paved county road and flagged down a passing milk truck at 4 a.m. The driver almost didn't stop. He slammed on the brakes and stared at me through the windshield. I must have looked insane. My clothes were covered in mud. My hands were bleeding. My face was white from the cold. I tried explaining what happened, but the words came out broken and useless. I kept looking over my shoulder toward the cemetery, expecting to see that tall shape standing between the headstones. Nothing followed me, at least nothing I could see. The next morning, 2 sheriff's deputies went out to the site. They found my smashed lantern, my pickaxe buried in a pile of collapsed, rotted oak, in a deep cave-in leading down into the old earth. They poured 3 truckloads of concrete into the hole and buried the kid in a different plot. The deputies told me there was no evidence of anyone else being there. No footprints, no second set of tracks, nothing. One of them even laughed and told me the rain probably washed everything away. I didn't laugh. I knew what I had seen. I knew what had grabbed my ankles, and I knew what had been underneath that grave. A few nights later, I woke up in my cabin at exactly 2 a.m. I was lying completely still. I couldn't move. The room was dark. Then I heard it. Scratch. I opened my eyes. Scratch. The sound was coming from beneath the bed. I didn't look. I couldn't. I lay there holding my breath until the sound stopped. Then 3 knocks came from underneath the mattress. Thud, thud, thud. I turned the lamp on. Nothing. The floor was empty. I told myself it was a dream. I told myself I was exhausted. But I never slept normally again. For several nights, I started sleeping with the lamp on. I would wake up every hour and stare at the floor, checking the space beneath the bed without actually having the courage to look underneath it. Every little sound became suspicious. Pipes settling, wind against the walls, rain tapping the window. None of it sounded normal anymore. Sometimes I would hear a faint creak beneath the mattress, and my entire body would go rigid. I knew how irrational it was. I knew the grave had been filled with concrete. I knew there was no way something could have followed me home. But fear doesn't care about what you know. It only cares about what you remember. I turned in my shovels that freezing December morning in 1973 and never dug another grave as long as I lived. But here's the twisted reality I live with every night. When I turn off the lamps and lie down in bed, I feel that heavy 1973 cemetery earth pressing down on my chest, and I hear that faint, sharp scratching right beneath my mattress, reminding me that the pit never really closed, and part of me is still trapped down in the dark. Sometimes the scratching lasts only a few seconds. Sometimes it goes on for minutes. And sometimes, just before sunrise, I hear something heavier beneath the bed. A slow movement, a wet drag, then silence. I never look underneath, because deep down, I already know what I would see. The same pale face, the same empty mouth, and those long, filthy fingers waiting patiently in the darkness, waiting for me to remember the grave, waiting for me to open it again. And every time I hear that first scratch beneath my mattress, I realize the truth I have spent my whole life trying to bury. I didn't escape that cemetery. I only climbed out of the grave. But there is one thing I never told the deputies. The morning after they filled the crypt with concrete, I went back alone. I stood outside the cemetery fence and watched the workers leave. The grave looked sealed. The concrete was fresh. Nothing could have come through it. At least, that's what I told myself. Then I noticed something in the wet ground beside the grave. 3 long marks. Fresh marks. They started at the concrete and continued across the mud toward the cemetery entrance. I followed them with my eyes until they disappeared between the trees. I never stepped inside. I didn't need to, because I already understood what they meant. Whatever had been under that grave had not been trapped there. It had simply learned where I lived. And 40 years later, when the house is silent and the lights are off, I still sometimes hear that same slow scratching beneath my bed. Scratch, scratch, then 3 knocks. Thud, 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 and I lie perfectly still, listening to whatever is underneath me. Because after all these years, I finally understand something. The creature was never trying to get out of the grave. It was trying to make sure I remembered where the grave was. And every night, when I hear it beneath my mattress, I know it is still waiting for me to dig again.